I've been told Tuchel is recruiting with an eye to giving himself the option to switch to a back four next season.
Hi guys, welcome back. This week I've got Liam Twomey, the Athletic's Chelsea correspondent and co-host of the Straight Outta Cobham podcast, alongside me to discuss their summer so far. Busy period at Chelsea is an understatement. There's been a bit of activity so far in the transfer market, and that's where we're going to begin. What's come into the club, the focus of our attention in that sense is Raheem Sterling. So tell us a little bit more about how that came about and just how important it is for Chelsea.
It's a huge deal for Chelsea. It's a big statement from the new owners, Todd Boehly and Clearlake Capital. I think it's the kind of statement they wanted to make, a player that clearly improves Thomas Tuchel's squad, a position of need, a proven Premier League winner, a high-value contributor to championship teams for a long time. And I think it was something of an opportunistic purchase, to be honest. Sterling had 1 year left on his Manchester City contract. He was clearly looking around for a new challenge. He'd fallen out of favour under Pep Guardiola. And Chelsea were there. They had a need. They were prepared to pay him like the main man, which I think Sterling wants to be. And that's the status he has at Stamford Bridge now.
On the flip side, there's been a number of departures so far, which I think has actually been a bit more eye-catching than the arrivals so far.
Yeah, so, Chelsea have lost Antonio Rudiger, Andreas Christensen for nothing, which is clearly not a situation that the new owners wanted to inherit. The defence is the most pressing need for this squad, and Sterling's arrival does not change that. They're now embarking on pre-season with a massive hole at the back of this team, particularly Rudiger, I think, because he was one of the best defenders in the world under Thomas Tuchel, also a really forceful personality in this squad. So Tuchel wants at least one defender, ideally two, to either fit around Thiago Silva or play instead of him in kind of more of a back four position, more of a back four shape, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But they need to get that done quite quickly so that they can get those players assimilated before the real football starts.
And that's in defence. There's also the not insignificant matter of attack with Romelu Lukaku leaving on loan as well. But you mentioned the owners there. This, of course, is the first transfer window post Roman Abramovic at Chelsea. You mentioned Todd Boehly in conjunction with Clearlake Capital and his fellow director, Behdad Eghbali. Of course, Thomas Tuchel in the mix as well as the head coach, who seems to be increasing in power. You wrote a piece on The Athletic that people can go and have a look at. Can you explain to us how things are working at Stamford Bridge in this pretty embryonic time and a time of huge change with those who have left and those who are now in position and pulling the strings?
Yeah, so it's a very streamlined process and one that involves Todd Boehly and Thomas Tuchel both shifting into very unfamiliar roles. There was a lot of surprise when Todd Boehly appointed himself interim sporting director in late June with the announcement of Marina Granovkaia's departure. And he is the one working the phones. He's the one talking to agents, talking to executives at other clubs and trying to get the details of these deals formalised. And Thomas Tuchel is having much more influence on who Chelsea target than most coaches certainly in the Roman Abramovich era. And so they still have Scott McLaughlin. They still have the extensive scouting network underneath him. I think you see that for example, in Jules Koundé still being on the radar. He's certainly a player that Chelsea have been tracking with their scouts for a long time. But in the main, this is a process that is centered around Tuchel and Boehly. Tuchel is telling Boehly what he wants for his team, and Boehly is going out and trying to get it for him.
Is that a risk, Liam? Because Todd Boehly, Behdad Eghbali, his fellow director, have never operated within football, let alone European football and the Premier League. Thomas Tuchel is a head coach, a vastly experienced one, but he's not a recruiter per se. There's no sporting director of experience and repute in this particular realm at the club at the moment. Marina Granovkaia, who's been running that operation for more than a decade, has gone. Petr Cech as well. I'd like to know if you think that this is a dangerous game Chelsea are playing. And also, are Granovskaia and Cech having any influence, or has the cord been cut?
Well, I mean, it was said in the statement that Granovskaia would still be available to the new hierarchy as and when they'd be needed. I don't think she will be consulted. That's just the impression I've been given. I think the new ownership are going in a very different direction, and Todd Boehly is managing everything himself. It is a risk because, as you say, Todd Boehly is learning on the job. He's highly experienced and successful in business, so you can imagine he's a pretty good negotiator. But the business of European football is entirely different, and I think what we've seen so far from Chelsea at least suggests that the new owners are not going to go out and just throw money around, because I think if they had, they would have got deals done already, more deals. They wouldn't necessarily have been good deals for Chelsea, but there would have been more action. The fact that things are advancing so slowly, I think at least suggests that Boehly is being quite exacting and quite meticulous in terms of trying to make sure Chelsea aren't taken for a ride. Because I think a lot of people in European football were looking at this situation thinking, yeah, we can get some money out of Chelsea this summer. It hasn't quite worked out that way. But it is a risk also in terms of Tuchel, because as you say, no coach has the time to watch as much football from as many different leagues as maybe a scout or a recruitment expert does. So his bank of knowledge about players will necessarily be smaller, and it maybe won't necessarily be quite as meticulous as a scout or a recruitment expert would be. But I have been told that he's been, leaning on a data company that he's worked with for many years, mainly for player performance data for his own players, but he's been using it to inform Chelsea's targets. And that is particularly relevant when we talk about Rafinha, because he's someone that showed up very well in terms of creative metrics with the company that Tuchel uses. So Rafinha was a player they wanted. They won't necessarily get him, but that gives some sort of insight into how this process is working.
It leads us nicely on to potential incomings and outgoings. It's a subject that many people watching this video will want to hear more about. I want you to explain as much as you know, because from my perspective, central defence is now key, or defence full stop, with names such as Koulibaly, Koundé, Kimpembe, all the K's there, in the mix. Nathan Ake as well. We know that personal terms are seemingly in place between him and Chelsea, but I don't think an agreement between the clubs. Clearly, they're spinning plates and have got different options. Matthijs de Ligt was in there too, but there appears to be a good chance that he'll go to Bayern Munich rather than Chelsea. And then when you look elsewhere in that back line, there are suggestions that Thomas Tuchel would like to improve at right and left back, with uncertainty over Cesar Azpilicueta and Alonso as well. Going further forward, you have question marks over the futures of, I don't know, N'Golo Kante only has a year to go on his contract. And then, crucially, into those wide areas and the forward line. You mentioned Rafinha. If he's not going to be coming and will be going to Barcelona as things stand, that seems to be the direction of travel, then will somebody else come in as an alternative to him? Will Chelsea sign a striker, with Lukaku seemingly needing to be replaced and no obvious candidate as things stand? So I'm going to throw it over to you to run us from the back of the pitch right the way to the front.
I think you summed it up pretty well there. To start with, Chelsea need surgery across the pitch.
Yeah.
And defensively, I've been told Tuchel is recruiting with an eye to giving himself the option to switch to a back four next season.
All right.
And I don't believe that he thinks that you can play a back four with Thiago Silva, at least not against the best, fastest attacks. It's just asking too much of him at this stage of his career. So for that, you're really looking for two new central defenders. And that's why you're seeing, whatever happens, whatever system Chelsea play next year, they definitely need a left-sided central defender. at least in Tuchel's eyes, having lost Rudiger. That's why you're seeing Ake, Kimpembe, players like that linked. Of course, Levi Colwill and his people will be watching that situation very closely as well. They also need cover for Ben Chilwell and Reece James, who I think Tuchel loves both of them, but we saw last season they can't necessarily be relied upon to play 60, 70 games. And then in midfield, you need to have a succession plan for Jorginho and Kante, but I wonder whether that will be parked for a year, because those guys are at least still under contract. So there isn't quite the same level of urgency. And you do have Conor Gallagher that you can maybe throw into that midfield mix as well. And Tuchel wants another forward in addition to Sterling. And we've seen of the forwards Chelsea have, the likeliest one to go is probably Hakim Ziyech. There's been lots of noise around Milan and their interest in him. I don't think there's anything close to an agreement between the clubs at the moment, because Milan look like they're trying to get him on the cheap, and Chelsea need to raise funds from selling some players. And that's the other half of this, is Boehly needs to work hard at being a seller as well as a buyer. And that's not easy when these guys are on Chelsea money. So they need significant reinforcements, but they also need to be mindful that they can't just have a 250 million net spend at the end of this window. That's just not realistic.
Well, there's an elephant in the room here, Cristiano Ronaldo. That's a story that we've reported very closely on The Athletic about Chelsea holding some discussions with his agent, George Mendes, Todd Boehly specifically on behalf of Chelsea, about a number of players when the pair of them met. And I'm sure there were many subjects of conversation, and Ronaldo's future and the possibility of him joining Chelsea was among them. Of course, Manchester United have maintained throughout this that he's not for sale and reminded us that he has a year to go on his contract. We've seen some comments in recent days from Erik ten Hag, their new manager, suggesting he's counting on Ronaldo. Some reports suggesting that Manchester United are working hard to change his mind, that mind being that he would like to leave Manchester United. We've reported that, and we've also said in a subsequent article that Chelsea are looking into the possibility of signing Cristiano Ronaldo. We don't know whether that's more something Todd Boehly would like to see, this sort of X-factor player, a bit of a Hollywood signing, as opposed to Thomas Tuchel, with some suggestions that he might not be as keen on the idea. But we don't have anything concrete on that front at the moment. But this is a subject that you and I need to address. Could you see that happening? Is it a realistic acquisition, or do you think that one is going to perhaps flitter away?
I don't think we can entirely rule it out, but I think it's very unlikely for several reasons. One, I can't see Tuchel being in favour. This is a guy who's very, very close to Ralf Rangnick and would only need to pick up the phone to Rangnick at any point and ask him what the experience was like of trying to coach Ronaldo into a pressing system last season. I just don't think he fits into a Tuchel team. There's always a tantalising thing with Ronaldo when you look at the goal return and you think as a coach, if I could just make that work in my system, we could have something special. But it hasn't really worked in his last two clubs, and he's at a stage of his career now where he's not necessarily going to change. The other reason why it's unlikely is because if Manchester United were going to soften their stance on selling Ronaldo, I would suspect there would be a price for European clubs, and then there would be a much higher price for a club like Chelsea, a domestic rival. I don't see how it would be. I don't see how it would be financially viable for Chelsea, or necessarily a good football fit. I could see why it would appeal to Todd Boehly and Clear Lake Capital, because it's exactly the kind of Hollywood. They're in LA at the moment. It's a Hollywood purchase. Bit of star power. The problem is those are exactly the things that attracted the Glazers and Ed Woodward to Ronaldo a year ago, and it didn't help Manchester United on the pitch.